The year was 1435, and behind the towering stone walls of Tiffauges Castle, something unspeakable was happening. While the rest of France celebrated their greatest military hero, the man who had stood beside Joan of Arc herself, a different kind of legend was being written in blood and terror. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval nobility and expose one of history's most carefully hidden monsters. This isn't just another tale of medieval brutality. This is the story of how absolute power corrupted absolutely, how wealth and status became weapons against the innocent, and how a national hero transformed into something so vile that even hardened judges would struggle to comprehend his crimes. The man we're discussing today didn't just fall from grace, he plummeted into depths of depravity that would make modern serial killers seem almost restrained by comparison. Picture this. You're a peasant family in 15th century France, struggling to survive in a world where a single bad harvest could mean starvation. Then one day, well-dressed servants arrive at your door bearing the seal of a Marshal of France. They speak of opportunity, of education for your son, of a chance to escape poverty forever. Your heart fills with hope as you dress your boy in his finest clothes and send him off to what you believe will be a better life. You never see him again. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a systematic hunting operation that claimed dozens, possibly hundreds of young lives across the French countryside. And at the center of it all was a man whose name should have been synonymous with heroism, not horror. Gilles De Rais, companion to Joan of Arc, Marshal of France, and one of the wealthiest nobles in the kingdom, had become something that defied comprehension. Born into unimaginable privilege in 1405, Gilles seemed destined for greatness from the very beginning. His family controlled vast estates stretching across Brittany and Anjou, making him one of the richest men in France before he even reached adulthood. By 25, he had already distinguished himself as a brilliant military commander, earning the trust of the future King Charles VII, and fighting alongside the legendary Joan of Arc during her miraculous campaigns. The bond between Gilles and Joan was forged in the crucible of warfare. At Orléans, he commanded the forces that broke the English siege, fighting with a ferocity that earned him both admiration and fear from friend and foe alike. He stood proudly beside Joan at Reims Cathedral when Charles VII was crowned King of France, a moment of triumph that should have secured his place among the greatest heroes in French history. The young nobleman was appointed Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors the kingdom could bestow. But something began to change after Joan's capture and execution in 1431. Those closest to Gilles noticed a darkness creeping into his demeanor that hadn't been there before. He withdrew from court life, retreating to his sprawling castles where he began spending his vast fortune on increasingly bizarre pursuits. Lavish theatrical productions featuring hundreds of actors drained his coffers at an alarming rate. His fascination with alchemy and the occult grew from mere curiosity to dangerous obsession. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was a gradual descent that made it all the more terrifying. Like poison seeping slowly through his soul, something corrupted was taking hold of the man who had once embodied French nobility. Servants began whispering about strange ceremonies conducted in the dead of night, about foreign alchemists and supposed sorcerers being welcomed into his inner circle with open arms. His contemporaries initially attributed this change to grief over Joan's death, believing that losing his beloved companion in arms had simply broken something inside him. But the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As his wealth dwindled from excessive spending, so too did his moral restraint. The villagers surrounding his estates began reporting an alarming pattern that would send chills down any parent's spine. Children were vanishing. Not just one or two, but dozens of them, all following a disturbingly similar pattern. Young boys between the ages of 8 and 12 were disappearing without a trace, leaving behind families torn apart by grief and communities living in constant fear. At first, These disappearances were attributed to the common dangers of medieval life: wolves, bandits, or simple accidents. But as the numbers grew, so did the suspicions of the local population. The missing children shared characteristics that would later prove crucial to understanding Gilles' predatory methodology. They were predominantly from impoverished families, boys whose disappearance might not immediately raise alarms among the authorities. Many were described as particularly beautiful or intelligent, traits that seemed to attract the marshal's attention in ways that nobody yet understood. Some had been seen near his castle shortly before vanishing, lured by promises that sounded too good to be true. What the villagers couldn't have known, what they couldn't have possibly imagined in their worst nightmares, was that behind the walls of Tiffauges, Machecoul, and Champtocé castles, unspeakable horrors were taking place. The man they had once celebrated as a national hero had become something that transcended their understanding of evil, using his power and position to prey upon the most vulnerable members of society. The methods Gilles employed to ensnare his victims reveal a calculating mind that understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities of medieval society. His servants would venture into nearby villages and towns, seeking out children from families so desperate that they might believe promises of a better life for their sons. The recruitment was always carefully tailored to each family's specific needs and circumstances. These weren't random abductions, they were carefully orchestrated operations. Positions as pages in the marshal's household, apprenticeships with skilled craftsmen, or simply the promise of regular meals and education were dangled before families who had little choice but to hope. The recruiting expeditions were methodically planned affairs, with Gilles' agents arriving well-dressed and bearing official seals that gave their offers an air of legitimacy that few could resist. In an era when noble patronage could genuinely transform a peasant child's life forever, the opportunity to serve in the household of a Marshal of France seemed like divine intervention. Parents would dress their sons in their finest clothes, often borrowed or specially made for the occasion, and send them off with hearts full of hope and prayers for their children's future success. Once inside the castle walls, the children would initially be treated with unexpected kindness. Witnesses later testified that Gilles would often spend days carefully grooming his victims, providing them with fine clothes, excellent food, and kind words that must have seemed like paradise to children who had known only poverty. This period of false kindness served multiple calculated purposes that reveal the depth of his manipulation. The isolation of Gilles' castles proved crucial to his horrific enterprise. Tiffauges, his favourite residence, was surrounded by dense forests and accessible only by closely guarded roads that he controlled completely. The fortress boasted multiple towers and deep dungeons that provided perfect locations for his activities, far from any prying eyes that might witness what was truly happening behind those stone walls. His immense wealth allowed him to maintain a large staff, many of whom became either complicit in his crimes or too terrified to speak out against their powerful master. The corruption spread through his household like a disease, creating a network of silence and protect complicity that would his secrets for nearly a decade. The complicity of Gilles' inner circle reveals the terrifying power of fear and greed to corrupt even ordinary people. His cousins, Gilles de Sillé and Roger de Briqueville, didn't merely turn a blind eye to his activities, they actively participated in procuring victims for their wealthy relative. His personal servants, Henriette Griard and Etienne Corillot, later confessed to disposing of bodies and cleaning up the horrific evidence of crimes that should have been impossible to conceal. Perhaps most disturbing was the role of Francesco Prelati, an Italian alchemist who had wormed his way into Gilles' confidence with promises of supernatural power. Prelati convinced the marshal that the blood of innocent children possessed mystical properties that could be harnessed through demonic rituals. Whether this charlatan truly believed his own claims or simply exploited Gilles' growing obsessions for personal gain remains unclear, but his influence undoubtedly escalated both the frequency and brutality of the murders. The systematic nature of these crimes demonstrates an organization that would be chilling even by modern standards. Bodies were methodically disposed of in castle fireplaces, with the ashes scattered to prevent discovery. Clothing was either burned completely or distributed to the poor in distant villages where it wouldn't be recognized. The few remains that couldn't be entirely destroyed were hidden within castle walls or buried in remote locations that only the inner circle knew about. What makes this systematic horror even more disturbing is how Gilles managed to maintain his public facade throughout this entire period. He continued fulfilling his duties as a nobleman with apparent normalcy, attending religious services with devotion, hosting other aristocrats with grace, and even commissioning religious artwork that adorned his chapels. This duality, the pious nobleman by day and predatory monster by night, allowed him to operate undetected for nearly a decade. The accounts that survive from his eventual trial provide testimonies that even hardened medieval judges found difficult to endure. The pattern of abuse followed a routine so horrifying that we must approach it with the gravity it deserves, while acknowledging the suffering of every victim. After the initial period of kind treatment designed to gain trust, Gilles would reveal his true nature in ways that demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that defies comprehension. Historical records indicate he derived sadistic pleasure from the terror of his victims, often prolonging their suffering for his own psychological gratification. His servants testified that he would sometimes offer comfort to the children only to resume his tortures moments later, creating cycles of hope and despair that speak to a mind so twisted it seemed to feed on psychological torment as much as physical violence. The involvement of occult practices adds another layer of horror to these already unthinkable crimes. Under Prelati's influence, Gilles became convinced that the blood of innocents held mystical properties that could unlock supernatural secrets. The rituals he conducted, described in chilling detail during his trial, combined murder with attempts at demon summoning that revealed the complete moral collapse of a man once considered a paragon of Christian knighthood. These ceremonies, conducted in the deepest chambers of his castles, involved Latin incantations copied from forbidden texts, arcane symbols carved into stone floors, and offerings that included parts of his victims. The very rooms where Joan of Arc might once have dined now witnessed horrors that would have made the Inquisition itself recoil in disgust. The sheer number of victims remains almost impossible to comprehend fully. Conservative estimates based on trial testimony place the count at around 80 children, but many historians believe the actual number exceeded 200 innocent lives. The discrepancy exists because many victims were never reported missing. Poor children, orphans, and those from traveling families who simply vanished without anyone powerful enough to demand justice for them. His servants' testimonies paint a picture of a household ruled by absolute terror. Those who participated in the crimes did so under constant threat of death, while others were kept deliberately ignorant of what occurred behind locked doors. The few who attempted to leave Gilles' service were either bribed into silence with substantial sums or met with suspicious accidents that served as warnings to others who might consider speaking out. This culture of fear extended far beyond the castle walls as local peasants learned to hide their children whenever the marshal's men came calling. Entire communities developed warning systems, with church bells ringing special patterns to alert parents when Gilles' recruiters were spotted in the area. The psychological warfare was as effective as any military campaign he had ever conducted. The impact on surrounding communities proved devastating beyond measure. Entire villages lost what amounted to a generation of their children. Families were destroyed not just by grief, but by the crushing guilt of having trusted their most precious possessions to a monster wearing the mask of nobility. The social fabric of the region was torn apart as neighbors began suspecting each other of complicity, and parents lived in constant terror for their remaining children. Yet through all of this systematic horror, Gilles maintained his position in society with remarkable success. His noble birth, military reputation, and vast wealth created a protective shield that seemed impenetrable to ordinary justice. Local officials, who might have investigated the disappearances, were either bought off with generous payments or intimidated into silence through subtle threats that everyone understood perfectly. The few who dared to raise questions found themselves facing the full weight of aristocratic displeasure. Complaints were dismissed as peasant superstition. Witnesses were discredited as unreliable. Physical evidence somehow vanished before it could be properly examined. The machinery of medieval justice, designed to protect the powerful rather than serve the innocent, functioned exactly as intended. It would take a dramatic act of overreach on Gilles' part to finally bring his reign of terror crashing down around him. By 1440, his extravagant lifestyle and failed alchemical experiments had drained even his enormous fortune. Desperate for funds to continue both his legitimate expenses and his horrific activities, he began selling off ancestral estates at prices far below their actual value. This financial desperation would ultimately lead to the single act of hubris that exposed his crimes to the harsh light of justice. When he violated church sanctuary to kidnap a priest in a dispute over property rights, he finally gave both secular and ecclesiastical authorities the legal pretext they had long sought to move against him. The investigation that followed was remarkably thorough by the standards of medieval jurisprudence. Bishop Jean de Malestroit of Nantes, who had been quietly gathering evidence about the missing children for years, finally possessed the legal grounds he needed to act decisively. The Duke of Brittany, eager to acquire Gilles' remaining properties for himself, threw his full support behind the ecclesiastical inquiry. The machinery of justice, so long held at bay by wealth and noble privilege, began grinding forward with inexorable momentum. What emerged during the preliminary investigations shocked even hardened church officials who had witnessed decades of human depravity. Commissioners appointed to gather evidence conducted what amounted to an early form of detective work, interviewing families of missing children across multiple provinces and collecting testimonies from former servants who had fled Gilles' employ in terror. They even conducted primitive forensic examinations, exhuming remains from locations specifically identified by confessing accomplices. The picture that emerged was so horrific that some investigators initially refused to believe their own findings could be accurate. How could a Marshal of France, a companion of the blessed Joan of Arc herself, be capable of such monstrous acts? Yet as witness after witness came forward with consistent accounts of horror, denial became impossible to maintain. The courage required for these testimonies cannot be overstated. In medieval society, accusing a nobleman of any crime carried enormous personal risk. These were peasant families with no legal protection, no political influence, and no guarantee that justice would prevail over power. Many had remained silent for years, paralyzed by fear or shame, believing that no one would listen to their accusations against such an exalted figure. But as word of the official investigation spread through the countryside, something remarkable occurred. Parents who had buried their grief in silence found their voices. Former servants who had escaped Gilles' household under cover of darkness returned to testify about horrors they had witnessed. Even some accomplices, sensing that their master's protection was finally crumbling, began cooperating with authorities in desperate attempts to save their own lives. The wall of silence and intimidation that had protected Gilles for nearly a decade collapsed with startling speed. Each testimony encouraged others to come forward. Each piece of evidence corroborated previous accounts. The conspiracy of fear that had enabled these crimes began unraveling as thoroughly as it had once protected them. The arrest of Gilles De Rais on September 15, 1440, sent shockwaves through the French nobility that reverberated across all of Europe. Here was a Marshal of France, a man who had dined with kings and commanded armies, being dragged before ecclesiastical courts on charges that seemed too monstrous for civilized society to contemplate. The very foundations of aristocratic privilege trembled as commoners watched their supposed betters face the same justice they themselves had always known. Initially, Gilles responded with the supreme arrogance typical of his class, refusing to recognize the court's authority over his noble person and threatening his accusers with dire retribution once this misunderstanding was resolved. He seemed genuinely to believe that his elevated status would protect him as it always had before, that this investigation was merely another obstacle to be overcome through influence and intimidation. However, as the evidence mounted like an avalanche of horror, even Gilles' legendary arrogance began showing cracks. The testimony of Henriette Griard and Etienne Corriot proved particularly devastating to any hope of maintaining his innocence. These personal servants, who had disposed of countless small bodies and cleaned blood from castle floors, provided detailed accounts that aligned perfectly with physical evidence discovered by investigators. Their confessions, given under oath with the threat of eternal damnation hanging over their souls, carried tremendous weight in the deeply religious society of medieval France. They described not just the murders themselves, but the locations where remains could be found, the methods used to dispose of evidence, and the systematic nature of operations that had continued for years under their direct participation. The trial itself became a public spectacle, unlike anything the region had witnessed in living memory. Held in the cathedral city of Nantes, it drew enormous crowds from across Brittany and beyond. Many came hoping to hear that the charges were false, that their celebrated hero had been victim of some elaborate conspiracy. Instead, they heard testimony that confirmed their darkest fears, while revealing horrors that exceeded even their most twisted imaginings. Two separate courts convened simultaneously to ensure that no legal technicality could allow Gilles to escape justice. An ecclesiastical tribunal addressed charges of heresy, sodomy, and invoking demons, while a secular court focused on the murders themselves. This dual approach reflected both the complexity of the accusations and the determination of authorities to leave no avenue for appeal or escape. The prosecutors had assembled an overwhelming case that would have impressed modern investigators. Over 100 witnesses stood ready to testify, including parents of victims, children who had somehow escaped before meeting their fate, and members of Gilles' own household staff. Physical evidence included human remains discovered in castle fireplaces, blood-stained clothing hidden in secret chambers, and the ritual paraphernalia of his occult ceremonies. Perhaps most damning were the detailed confessions of his primary accomplices, who provided accounts so consistent and specific that their authenticity seemed undeniable. These men described not just individual murders, but an entire system of procurement, abuse, and disposal that had operated with business-like efficiency for nearly a decade. The testimony of parents proved heartbreaking beyond description. Mother after mother, father after father, took the witness stand to describe how their beloved sons had been lured away with promises of prosperity and education. Many wept openly as they recounted their final glimpses of children dressed in their finest clothes, excited about opportunities that seemed like answered prayers. Some families had received brief messages claiming their boys were thriving in their new positions, only to never hear another word as months turned to years. Others had searched desperately across the countryside, following rumors and false leads that led nowhere but deeper despair. The accumulated grief of so many shattered families filled that courtroom with an atmosphere of mourning that even hardened officials found difficult to endure. The testimony of Perrine Martin, known locally as La Meffraie, or the Terror, proved particularly significant in establishing the systematic nature of these crimes. This elderly woman had served as one of Gilles' primary recruiters, identifying suitable victims and approaching their families with carefully crafted offers of employment. Her matter-of-fact recounting of her role shocked even experienced judges who had witnessed countless human evils throughout their careers. She described in clinical detail how she would observe children during market days and religious festivals, noting those who appeared intelligent, healthy, and attractive. She would then research their family circumstances, identifying those desperate enough to believe promises of advancement. Her approach was methodical, professional, and utterly without conscience or remorse. As evidence mounted like stones in an avalanche, Gilles' composure began deteriorating visibly. His initial arrogance gave way to desperate attempts at intimidation, then to bargaining, and finally to something approaching panic as he realized that his noble status would not save him from the consequences of his actions. On October 15th, faced with the explicit threat of torture and excommunication from the church that had once celebrated his piety, Gilles suddenly and dramatically collapsed. In a scene that stunned the packed courtroom, he fell to his knees and confessed not just to the charges against him, but to crimes even more extensive than prosecutors had alleged. His confession, delivered first in Latin and then translated into French for the assembled crowd, was so detailed and horrific that judges ordered all women and children removed from the courtroom before allowing him to continue. What followed was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of medieval justice, as a Marshal of France publicly admitted to murders so numerous and brutal that even his own legal counsel seemed stunned into silence. The transformation was as sudden as it was complete. The man who had threatened investigators just days earlier now seemed to embrace his guilt with an enthusiasm that bordered on the theatrical. He begged forgiveness from the families of his victims, asked for their prayers, and delivered impromptu sermons warning others against the sins of pride and excess that had led to his downfall. Some historians have interpreted this dramatic transformation as genuine repentance from a tormented soul, finally freed from years of deception. Others see it as the final performance of a consummate manipulator who understood that his only hope for avoiding eternal damnation lay in spectacular public contrition. The truth, like so much about Gilles De Rais, remains shrouded in the darkness he had created around himself. The verdict was never truly in doubt once his confession echoed through that stone chamber. On October 25, 1440, both courts found Gilles guilty on all charges. The sentence reflected the dual nature of his crimes, death by hanging followed by burning, a punishment that addressed both his secular murders and his ecclesiastical heresies. In a final concession to his noble blood, the court agreed that his body could be removed from the flames before complete consumption, allowing his family the dignity of Christian burial. The execution was scheduled for October 26th in the meadow of Biesse, chosen specifically to accommodate the enormous crowd expected to witness the fall of one of France's most notorious criminals. By dawn, thousands had gathered from across the region, including many parents whose children had vanished into those castle chambers never to return. The day began with an elaborate religious procession that seemed designed to transform a monster back into a man worthy of God's mercy. Gilles, dressed in white robes of penitence, walked barefoot through the streets of Nantes, carrying a candle and stopping at various churches to pray for his soul and beg forgiveness from the families he had destroyed. At the scaffold, Gilles delivered his final words to the assembled masses, warning parents to guard their children carefully and young nobles to resist the temptations of pride and excess. Whether his final performance was genuine repentance or calculated theatre mattered little to the families who watched justice finally claim the monster who had stolen their sons. The rope tightened, the flames rose, and with them died not just a man, but the illusion that noble birth could shield anyone from the consequences of ultimate evil. The children's voices, silenced in those dark chambers, had finally found their justice in the roar of that righteous fire.